Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Kairani Baroka, and I'm a research fellow with the UAL Decolonising Arts Institute. You can find out more about the Institute on our web pages and by signing up for our newsletter at decolonising.arts.ac.uk. Welcome to the fourth of the Institute's research season roundtables under the theme of Cultural Urgencies, Actions Toward Representation, Equity, Justice, and Well-Being. The Cultural Urgencies roundtables have been taking place on Tuesday afternoons throughout March, convened by the Institute's research fellows and associates. Our first event on decentering fashion was guest hosted by Professor Shahida Bari with colleagues from the Cultural and Historical Studies Department at LCF and guests from the V&A. This was followed by Decolonising the University and the Role of Linguistic Diversity, hosted by Dr. Victoria Odeni. Last week, I convened a discussion on cultural narratives of interlocking crises, COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. Today's session, hosted by Dr. Ileana-Lucia Selejan, will focus on Roma Lives, Reflections on Art and Visual Culture. Next week, the final roundtable will explore Curating Black British Art Now, hosted by Dr. Anjali Dalal-Clayton. Before I hand over to Ileana to introduce today's event and speakers, let me run through some housekeeping. Firstly, please be aware that mics and cameras are automatically muted. You can accept live transcript if required. You can post questions and comments to the chat box. You can also use the Q&A box when this is opened for these segments. And please note that the event is being recorded for the Institute's research archive, and selected excerpts may be shared post-research season. Over to Ileana.
Thank you so much, Oka, and thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel. My name is Ileana Selejan, and I am a research fellow at the Decolonising Arts Institute. It is my great pleasure to have you all here today. I convened today's panel because I believe that ongoing discrimination and the continued violation of the rights of people of Roma and Romani descent constitute some of the most pressing issues of our time, a situation furthermore exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. As a scholar, I am interested in the ways in which the Roma have been represented and misrepresented in popular visual culture broadly understood, and how this inhibits conversations around rights and possibilities for direct action. I am also interested in how artists, and specifically artists of Romani descent, have found means to counter these narratives, often by operating from within spaces of exclusion. So to this end, I have invited 4 esteemed artists and scholars who are working across a number of fields in academia and in the cultural field as a whole. I would like to thank Dr. Daniel Baker, Professor Ethel Brooks, Christina Grigori, and Delaine Lebas for kindly accepting the invitation to join us today. I also wish to thank Professor Jane Collins from UAL, who has agreed to participate in the discussion and chair one of the sessions. Many thanks also to our Institute Director, Susan Poisson-Locke, for supporting this initiative, and to the Institute team, especially Claire Pattenden and Hannah Rowe, who have provided invaluable support in organizing today's event. Not least, thanks to Lynn Finn for the technical support. So before we begin, I just want to give you a brief run through the program. We will have 2 sessions with 5 minutes, with a very short 5 minutes break in between. After the second session, we will have a brief conversation between participants in response to all of the talks. And then we will open the floor to questions from the audience. And if you think of questions while the speakers are presenting their talks, you're welcome to use the Q&A section of the screen to pop in those questions, but we'll get to them later on. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce now our first speaker, Dr. Daniel Baker. He is an artist, curator, and researcher. He is a Romani gypsy born in Kent, holds a PhD on the subject of gypsy aesthetics from the Royal College of Art, London. Baker curated Future Roma, at the 58th International Art Exhibition at the Venice Biennale in 2019. And I invite you to visit the website and to take a look at the catalog. It's all available online. He acted as exhibitor and advisor to the first and second Roma pavilions, Paradise Lost and Called a Witness at the 52nd and 54th Venice Biennale, respectively. Publications include We Roma, a critical reader of contemporary art, brilliant book, Ex Libris and Futuroma. Daniel Baker is the former chair of the Gypsy Council. Thank you, Daniel. Handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Elena. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the whole event. I'm going to begin with a 15-minute film, which is going to be a presentation of the Future Roma project, plus something about my work for context and a little bit about me. So without further ado, I will attempt to share my screen with you and to play my content. So I shall see you on the other side. Hello, my name is Daniel Baker. I'm going to start with a couple of images of a place called Cork's Meadow, otherwise known as the Pit. This is because it was located in a chalk pit in St Mary Cray in Kent. My family lived here for a number of years before the sale of the land in the early 1950s. These photos were taken by Bert Hardy for an article that appeared in Picture Post in July 1951 titled The Unromantic Gypsies. This second picture shows my grandfather Daniel Coates and three of my siblings, Celia, Samuel and Benjamin. I'll now show a few images of my own artworks for context, my art practice being the main focus of my work and which in turn informs my other activities. I then show images from the Future Roma project. My broader practice is made up of three strands: making, curating and writing, a methodology that I developed during my doctoral research into gypsy aesthetics at the RCA in 2011. My interest in the visual gypsy was first sparked at the turn of the century during my MA research into LGBTQ+ Roma identities. Key themes that emerged within my dissertation titled The Queer Gypsy concerned the visibility of the Roma body in society and the consequent mutability of identities. The paradoxical state of compromised yet dynamic visibility that I identified has continued to underpin my practice to date. My thesis was titled Gypsy Visuality, Alfred Gell's Art Nexus and its Potential for Artists. I used Alfred Gell's anthropological theory of art called the Art Nexus to examine the network of social relations that surround gypsy visual culture. The main aim was to identify key elements of the Roma aesthetic and determine the meanings therein. I used my studio practice as an instrument of interpretation and analysis during my research to test out my developing findings. My thesis also acted as a critique of the Art Nexus in order to strengthen its further application. My research identified some key qualities evident within the Roma aesthetic, including a concurrency of display and concealment, attraction and diversion, the ornamental and the abject. Qualities included showiness, shininess, discordance, multi-sidedness, and multifunctionality. These elements and their effects on the viewer continue to be worked through in my own art practice in order to examine their wider implications. Future Roma can be seen as a continuation of these preoccupations. Future Roma was commissioned by the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture as an official collateral event of the 58th International Art Exhibition at the Venice Biennale in 2019. The project marked the third incarnation of a Romany presence at the Biennale, but it was the first time the initiative was led by Roma themselves. At the beginning of the 21st century, as my attention turned toward the artistic output of my own Romany community in the UK, I was struck by the lack of any formal analysis of our visual culture, a lack which seemed to me to echo our visibility, or lack of it, within society. This absence of attention highlighted for me a direct relationship between cultural visibility and social agency for Roma, and compelled me to find out more about the role of visuality within our lives. This I have continued to pursue through my own art making and connected practices, which draw upon my wider research into the functioning and implication of Roma aesthetics. Future Roma expands upon these points by drawing together a number of strands that I've been interested in for a long time. The links between the traditional and the contemporary, between domestic and professional artistic practices, and between individual archives and state collections. These hierarchies of practice, collecting, and dissemination can otherwise be thought of as emblematic of the relationship between the marginal and the elite. By looking into the often discriminatory relationship between marginal artistic practices and those that form the centre ground, we can find new ways of thinking about relationships between marginalised peoples and mainstream society. The art object is where artist, subject, and audience meet, and where meaning is shaped and exchanged. Artworks generate a variety of meanings, each dependent upon the context in which they are presented. Within this understanding of the workings of art, the potential outcomes are manifold, as are the various roles that the art object can be seen to perform. At the heart of my interest is a preoccupation with the role of art in affecting change. One of the ways that art can affect change is by showing us the value of that which is overlooked. When we are encouraged to look again at such objects and ideas, we look again at the people that have generated them. In this way, the artwork acts as an extension of the artist, which in turn acts as an extension of their community. Through re-evaluating such objects, we are motivated to re-evaluate their makers and therefore the culture from which they emerge. This repositioning of artworks, people, and communities encourages us to build new futures, while at the same time allowing us to re-examine our collective past. Future Roma draws upon aspects of Afrofuturism to explore Roma contemporary art's role in defining, reflecting, and influencing Roma culture. The project set out to offer new and spontaneous reinterpretations of Roma past, present, and future via a fusion of the traditional and the futuristic, in order to critique the current moment for Roma people and to re-examine historical events. By imagining Roma bodies in speculative futures, the exhibition offered a counter-narrative to the reductive ways that Roma culture has been understood and constructed to date, thereby moving our cultural expression beyond the restrictive motifs of oppression toward a radical and progressive vision of Roma to come. The confluence of traditional knowledge and contemporary art practice evident within the works on display combined to highlight possibilities for different ways of being. Here, artworks are rooted in the techniques and traditions of the Roma diaspora, but at the same time decisively forward-looking. The resulting narratives manifest ambitious visions of life-affirming futures and at the same time allow a reinterpretation of what has gone before. Here, meaning unfolds along the dual paths of remembering and imagining, inherently intertwined in order to allow the political to be actioned within the artworks. In remembering, we uncover that which might be obscured, whilst in imagining, we invest into another future. The show was international and intergenerational in its approach, with 14 artists originating from 8 countries, and artists ranging from 27 to 95 years of age. The variety of practice included elements from traditional domestic activities such as needlework and plant propagation to the digital disciplines of photography and filmmaking. Each artwork was chosen for its ability to convey meaning rather than the reputation of the artist. The resulting ensemble represents a broad cross-section of activity, from the domestic to the academic, and from the professionally trained to the self-taught. This unification of domestic artistic practice and contemporary art modes of working allows us to uncover new connections across these fields, whilst offering greater insight into the meanings and implications that they carry for broader ways of thinking. In their unique manner, each of the artworks on display variously employed and deconstructed different aspects of the primeval, the everyday, and the futuristic. Objects moved between the familiar and the unexpected, taking us beyond the confines of time and place to a different kind of objectivity. Implications of materiality, physical stuff that takes up space in the world. After all, it is the Roma's physical presence that is continually contested, marked by questions of where and how we are permitted to exist. As well as being a means to rediscover our history in an impactful and engaging way, the exhibition was a chance to envision a future where we as Roma truly belong. Too often we are told that we have no future, that we remain relics of the past. In a counter move, the exhibition presented an alternative perspective, informed by all that came before and the promise of all that can be, whilst at the same time locating us firmly in the here and now. Throughout the show, elements from the realms of domestic practice and contemporary art were brought together to question the different ways that we encounter objects and how these encounters can influence our understanding of them and the meanings that they carry. By encouraging us to think again about the role of the traditional within the contemporary, the works on display highlighted synergies between differing modes of making, enabling us to engage with the concerns of Roma communities and the ways in which those concerns inform Roma contemporary art practice. The resulting configuration of artworks was intended to interrupt expectation and push toward new insight, highlighting the potential for Roma artistic practice and its consequent visibilities to interrupt prejudice and make way for new narratives. Within the exhibition, disparate elements are brought together to offer a kind of unification amid various networks of difference, joining together in greater or lesser harmonies to produce eloquent renderings of the paths that we as Roma continue to navigate. By recontextualizing our past, these objects help us to reimagine our future, a future in which we as Roma are fully recognized for our participation as valued citizens. Resistance remains a recurring element across Roma art practice and the Roma aesthetic, producing artworks that operate as arbiters of visibility, recognition, and equality. Many of the works in Future Roma combine visual and material signifiers to produce resistant objects which at once occupy the realms of the domestic and the political. Here biographies are written large within the fabric of the artworks, making the artist a constant presence. This codependence between the social and the artistic is where the boundaries between life and art disappear, to show a direct relationship between cultural visibility and social agency. By subverting our expectation, these and objects like them resist preconception to challenge the judgment that often follows. Most enact resistance not through overt political acts, but through subtler and perhaps more compelling means. The exhibition was about more than a group of objects. It was about the people that made those objects. By emphasizing the universality of the Roma experience, Future Roma sought to highlight the inequality evidenced by the widespread excision of Roma histories from state narratives, and in so doing, enact the potential for such histories to be challenged and reset. I want to talk briefly about one of the works from the show. Laszlo Varga's drawing titled Study the Infinite places the idea of space and movement at its centre. The existential imperative of liberty is taken forward here by offering the possibility of limitless space and infinite potential. These notions of liberation, of freedom, and conversely their restrictions, were explored through the inclusion of this artwork, whose actual presence I was not able to secure for display from the Museum of Ethnography in Budapest, an institution which holds an extensive collection of important works by Roma artists in its underground storage facility close to public view. In place of Varga's drawing, 1,000 postcards were produced bearing its image for display and distribution to highlight the questions regarding the liberation of Roma cultural capital and to act as symbolic of wider Roma emancipatory issues. The Future Roma catalogue can be downloaded from the CV page of my website. Thank you. Thank you for watching that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Okay.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for introducing your work and also for speaking at length about this really fantastic project. And I thought the discussion of Varga's piece is really, really beautiful, and we should definitely get back to that, I think, in the conversation. So thanks a lot.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
So, okay, and now I'd like to introduce our second speaker today, artist Delaine Lebas. She is a cross-disciplinary artist creating installations, performances, photography, and films. One of her works graces the cover of our event today, a self-portrait. Most recently, creating a new installation of works, Saint Sarah Kali George, for Berlin Biennale 2020. Works were included in Venice Biennial 2019 for Future Roma, and Paradise Lost, which was the first Roma pavilion at the Venice Biennale of 2007, Athens Biennale 2018, Off Biennale Budapest 2015, Gwangju Biennial 2012, Prague Biennial 2005 and 2007. Delaine created the costumes for the Roma Armée 2017 and Re-Witching Europe 2019 at the Maxim Gorky Theatre in Berlin. She is currently a guest professor at the University of the Arts, Berlin. And if I might add, she is also an alumna of CSM, Central St. Martin's School here at UAL. So Delaine, if you'd like to join us. I can't see you.
It's on. It is on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Ileana, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon. Yeah, I was at St. Martin's many years ago, 1986 to 1988. So that's a long time now. So I'm going to start. Well, I'm going to show all films this afternoon, actually, just to give an overview. But they're really quite important to me because they're about invisibility and visibility, which I think as a community is the one thing we really suffer from. And so we have this high visibility in one sense and an invisibility in another sense, and also about erasure. And I will talk about that as we go through the films. So the first film I want to start with is a film called Achamesko Tan, which is Stopping Place in Romany. And it was made in 2012, working with the Romany Arts and Cultural Company, which is based in Cardiff, and Chapter, who I'd previously worked with in 2009 for my ongoing exhibition, Witch Hunt, which was commissioned in 2008, but still tours now. So it was part of an exhibition called O Brynjiste Terata, which is from the Rainbow, which is Welsh Romany for, and is in the dialects of the Gypsies of Wales by John Sampson. So it was a combination of things about stopping places, and the place that I'm actually filmed was an original stopping place, which wasn't actually far from Chapter. So yeah, so if we could start that film, that would be great, and then I'll introduce. No, this isn't the right one. Sorry. This is it. Okay, thank you. So the next film coming up is part of there were 4 films actually made for this, and you'll be seeing one of those films as the 4th film that's shown. But it was for a strategic touring program that I did, which was called To Gypsyland, which was based from the book by Elizabeth Robbins Pennell that was published in 1893. And it was about really the search for the real gypsies, whatever that means. And so I started at 198 in contemporary arts and learning. This is the film.
Oh.
It was the film, sorry. And so the whole thing started 198 Contemporary Arts and Learning in London, and it was a studio practice and archive project that grew into the strategic touring programme. And in the strategic touring programme, I went to Glasgow, Peterborough, Bolton, and then we returned back to London. It was really about reclaiming the space, because we have been in all these spaces, but you see us, but you don't see us. We're visible, but we're invisible, and we're erased most of the time as well. So this also involved my 2 friends and co-collaborators who I continue to work with, which is Tara Darby, who's a photographer who did some of the filming and I did the rest, and Ronki Asanawa, who's a writer, and she produced a book which is called I Bring You Tilbury Town. And Ronki is Nigerian by birth, but she was raised by Romani gypsies. And that's her own story, but if you read her book, you will find her story within that book. So I'd like you to see that one now. Thank you. That's the wonderful. So the next film is called Crystal Ball Genocide at the Unfinished Memorial for Sinti in Roma near the Reichstag, Berlin. And it was filmed on Friday, the 27th of January, 2012. At that time, the memorial wasn't finished. And I'd been thinking about this for some time because there'd been various arguments about the memorial, and it wasn't due to be completed. But by October that year, it was finished. The real problem is, and this is one of the reasons I'm showing this film, is the memorial is now under threat because there is some argument about new metro station being put in Berlin, and this may at least disturb the memorial at the minimal impact to it. And it seems like actually, you know, we're heading up towards its 10th anniversary and it might not actually be there. So yeah, it's quite a disturbing prospect at the moment, really, but more to come on that one. So we'll just show this film now, and this was the state that it was when we were there in the January.
Not so easy. No, it won't. There's a gap in the middle. Bit wide.
Are you coming in? Good.
And the last film is from the Two Gypsyland series, and this was made in Bolton, and it was made with the Bolton Whitmanites, and myself and Barbie Asante, who co-curated Two Gypsyland with me, went for a walk with the Bolton Whitmanites on the 1st of June in 2013, and it's they go that day because it's Walt Whitman's birthday, and everyone reads Walt Whitman poetry and everything, but it's also with a reference to Gypsyland because Elizabeth Robbins Pennells knew Walt Whitman, and in the book she describes Walt Whitman as being a friend of gypsies where he lived in America. But one of the reasons why we were collaborating with them is because they do this walk and it goes to Winter Hill, which is this site which this year is celebrating its 125th anniversary from the people in Bolton going up and trespassing on the land for their right of way there. And it's very relevant now at this moment in time, particularly in the UK, because of this new criminal bill that the government is pushing through here about trespass. And this is going to affect so many people. So what I'm also interested in is collaborating with other people who actually are coming from a similar place to where we come from, and how often things that are used by the powers that be and the powers in control to use us as a scapegoat actually end up influencing everybody else and their rights and their human rights as well. So this is why it's very important for me to collaborate and work with other people as well. So this is the last film, and I won't say anything else after this. I'll leave it for questions.
Came last Sunday, but there's room for 1,000 still. All the moors are rare and bonny, and the heather sweet as wine, and the road across the hillside is the people's, yours and mine. So come Sunday morning for a walk o'er Winter Hill. 10,000 went last Sunday, but there's room for 1,000 still. Hey.
Adieu, dear comrade. Your mission is fulfilled, but I, more warlike, myself and this contentious soul of mine, still on our own campaigning bound, through untried roads with ambushes, opponents lined, through many a sharp defeat and many a crisis, often baffled, here, marching, ever marching on, a war fight out, here, to fiercer, weightier battles give expression.
The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my garb and my loitering. I too am not a bit tamed. I am too untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yawp over the roofs of the world. The last scud of day holds back for me. It flings my likeness after the rest and true as any on the shadowed worlds. It coaxes me into the vapour and the dusk. I depart as air. I shake my white locks at the runaway sun. I effuse my flesh in eddies and drift it in lacy jags. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You will hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good health to you nevertheless, and filter and fibre your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere, waiting for you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Delaine, and lots of thoughts and questions. Very moving pieces. I was particularly drawn to the third film that you showed, and in thinking about the significance of the Roma and Sinti Memorial in Berlin and the significance of creating a performance in that space where many other artists have kind of questioned the meaning of nationhood, the meaning of ethnicity within the larger kind of envelope of nationhood, particularly in the German context. And I'm thinking about Hans Hake's intervention, where he contemplates the title written on the Bundestag, dem deutschen Volke, with this piece that he titles Der Bevölkerung, so the people. So questioning who belongs there, who doesn't belong, who is this people, and just how your work in general engages with notions of particularly belonging and nationhood and community. And I would love to return in the Q&A and in the discussion to also your fantastic project, the Roma Embassy, and all of the different performances that you've done, thinking about this notion of a Roma identity that is transnational, is truly global, within the confines of the very strict confines of the nation states that we've inherited. So thank you very much. And so I think now we'll just take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back in exactly 5 minutes, and we'll move into the second session. And yeah, so thank you, Delaine, thank you, Daniel, and thanks everyone. Okay, so I hope everyone's back. I would now like to introduce my colleague, Jane Collins, who will be chairing this second session of our of today's panel. So Jane is a professor of theatre and performance at Wimbledon College of Art, a part of UAL. She's a writer, director, and theatre maker who works all over the UK and internationally. Collins collaborated with Ethel during the AHRC funded residency project titled Performing Romani Identities, Strategy and Critique. She is a founding member of UAL's Performance Network, an interdisciplinary network of artists who run workshops and performance-related events across the university, and she's co-editor of the new Routledge journal, Theatre and Performance Design. So Jane, if you would please join, and yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ileana. Welcome back, everyone, and it is my great pleasure to introduce two more, in this instance, Romani scholars and activists who I know are going to do two extraordinary presentations. The first presentation is by Professor Ethel Brooks, who we know well at UAL because we've worked on various projects with her. Ethel is chair and acting graduate director of the Departments of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University and associate professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Sociology at Rutgers, where she has taught since 2000. Since 2012, she has been a Tate-trained transnational fellow at the University of the Arts London, and Brooks was appointed under President Obama to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. And that obviously ties up with some of the things that Delaine has just been talking about, where she served from 2015 to 2020. She is chair of the board of the European Roma Rights Centre, and Brooks is the author of Unravelling the Garment Industry, Transnational Organising and Women's Work, which was winner of the 2010 Outstanding Book from the Global Division of Society for the Study of Social Problems. Her current book focuses on histories of encampment, claim staking, and Romany futures. And I can't think of anybody better to talk to this project than Ethel. So Ethel, if you're there, here she is. Hello. We need to get your mic on.
Sorry. Thanks, Jane, for that lovely introduction. It's lovely to see you, and it's a pleasure to be here. And today I'm going to talk about refusal and resignifications of value, and thinking in particular. So if we even just commenting on sort of the politics of refusal that we see in the image that of Delaine's gypsy girl with a gun after Sven Berlin 2017, we see a kind of way in which there's a refusal there in Delaine not showing her face as she's creating the portrait with the gun as paintbrushes as gun, and I think it's really important when we talk about decolonization, right, to talk about refusal as practice, as politics, as survival, and maybe not necessarily even direct right out refusal, but rather refusal as a form of holding precious that which has sustained us, of keeping sacred and the sacred as a form of protection and as a form of resistance. And so I want to begin with two quotes that I'd like us to contemplate as we're sort of thinking through this question. One is from Frantz Fanon, and it's from Black Skin, White Masks, where he says, quote, "The white man wants the world. He wants it for himself alone. He finds himself predestined master of his world. He enslaves it. An acquisitive relation is established between the world and him, but there exist other values that fit only my forms." So the original in French, right, the end of that, he says, that bit is, "Mais il existe des valeurs qui ne se commodent qu'à ma sauce," right? So there are values that are only served with my sauce. And then he says, like a magician, I robbed the white man of a certain world, forever lost to him and his. Somewhere beyond the objective world of farms and banana trees and rubber trees, I have subtly brought the real world into being. The essence of the world was my fortune, end quote. And here, right, I think it's really important for us when we think about refusal to also understand the ways in which Romani people have been caught up in, and really, and this point I think that was made by Delaine about us being kind of these canaries in a coal mine, right? So what happens to us, like with this new law around that's going to affect settlements and stopping and all sorts of things about occupation of space in the UK, right? There's a way in which that kind of the ways in which Romani people, and as Daniel said, as Delaine said, are sort of visible, hyper visible, and yet invisible in these larger movements, but really central to those movements. And that's really key. And so the other part of that I wanted to talk about was a quote, or to share with you, was a quote by Rigoberta Menchú. And this is in her book, which has kind of circulated and has been famous at various times, but is really a kind of this testimony about the existence of a kind of indigenous politics and a revolutionary politics. And the end paragraph of her book, she says, quote, This is why I've traveled to many places where I've had the opportunity to talk about my people. Of course, I need a lot of time to tell you all about my people because it's not easy to understand just like that. And I think I've given some idea of that in my account. Nevertheless, I am still keeping my Indian identity a secret. I'm still keeping secret what I think no one should know, not even anthropologists or intellectuals, no matter how many books they have, can find out all of our secrets, end quote. And so that question of refusal, I think, is really key when we talk about this, right? And again, other instances of it, you know, if we look at Coco Fusco and Guillermo Gomez Peña's performance at the during the 500th anniversary of the conquest of the Americas, right, where at some point Gomez Peña writes on his body, "Please don't discover me." And so I've been thinking a lot about this form of refusal. And one of the ways it hit me was last week when I was in conversation with Lauan Matadi about her film Taikon. And I'm going to share my screen with you now. And I'm hoping that this works so you can see the images. This is the one. Yes. And then I'm going to put the slideshow version on so you can see it. Everybody can see that that's good. Lauan Matadi has written a book and created a film, a documentary film about the life of the Swedish Romani sisters, Katarina and Rosa Taikon. And the film shows their artistic practice, right? They came from a family of circus performers and metal workers in Sweden, a Roma family. And as they grew up, they acted and worked in their family's circus. They became politically minded as they kind of came into adulthood and saw the ways in which Romani people were kept from education. They were, put in substandard accommodation and housing. Romani people were living in, and were relegated to living in tents on kind of, waste dumps, while Swedish people were given, access to social housing, access to land, and Swedish Roma were denied that continually from the 19th century through the 20th century. So Rosa later in life was a silversmith, and Katarina was a children's author, right? So the Katici series was really quite, read by all children all over Sweden. And it was a way of kind of telling the stories of her childhood, but also maintaining a kind of claim upon rights for Roma in Sweden. And their politics really focused on advocating with the Swedish state, protesting against the Swedish state around kind of, on behalf of Romani human rights, from housing to schooling, cultural integrity, and equality of Roma in Sweden. So as Lauan was showing, this was the film. This is an image, a still from the film, which I think is kind of amazing. As Lauan, we were having a conversation, and I asked her about the first time she met Rosa Taikon. And by the time she'd begun the project, Katarina had already passed away. She passed away in the 1990s. And she talked about how she, as an Iranian Kurdish Swedish woman, had been amazed to be in a local library somewhere kind of in the countryside of Sweden. And she saw a photo, and it was this photo that I'm showing now. That's the cover of her book. Mid-century gorgeous, right, of Katarina Taikon, and it was on the local library wall. And what struck her was that, she, as an Iranian Kurdish Swede, hadn't really seen any images of women who looked like her in the public sphere in Sweden. So this kind of image of Katarina on the library became really it really shifted her view of Sweden. And she started to look up, who is this person, what was going on. And so that kind of powerful moment of her seeing particularly another brown woman's face on the wall, pushed her to learn about Katarina's life. And in that way, she learned about the history of Roma in Sweden. And in particular, began to sort of connect it to her own history as an immigrant into Sweden. So she contacted Rosa Taikon to ask for a meeting to talk about the possibility of either doing a film or writing an article or something. And Rosa invited Lowen to visit her home, but said directly, as a precursor to any conversation, "This is political. Remember that." And that phrase really struck me. And that's why I wanted to kind of focus on this question, right? Its point, right? It set the terms of engagement. It claimed relation through politics. It refused, alternately, engagement through an extraction of culture. And colonization, as settlement, as extraction, as appropriation, has tried to frame the terms of engagement never as political, right? Never as about resources, about access, about voice, right? But rather as culture, as Romani culture, as difference. And when we talk about questions of decolonization, right, we have to remember that Romani studies itself and the sort of formation of Roma within the public sphere as the, kind of notion of the romantic gypsy began as part of a larger European colonial project in which, beginning at the end of the 18th century, the production of knowledge and the framing of that knowledge as science became part of the foundation and expansion of European empires into the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and beyond. As part of colonial management and governance, as science, as the creation of archives, of museums, laboratories, right, dedicated to understanding the cultures, the people, the languages, the everyday lives of the colonized, a body of knowledge about Europe's others was produced and would later become known as area studies. As Edward Said argues in Orientalism, this body of knowledge was constituted through, quote, an enormous systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage and even produce the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively during the post-Enlightenment period. And I think it's really, key, right? When we talk about decolonizing the arts, we have to think about that imaginative moment of constructing an Oriental other. And Ken Lee builds upon that, right, by drawing from Said. So Romani sociologist Ken Lee, who's based in Australia now, powerfully argues, quote, that part of, he argues that this kind of the construction of the Romani subject through the kind of discipline of gypsy lorism produces Romani people as legible subjects of the nation state of empire. And he argues, quote, gypsy lorism can thus be seen as that field of study which discursively constitutes as its subject the gypsies. Like Orientalism, gypsy lorism is a discursive formation that emerges from asymmetrical exchanges of power in different sorts, political, economic, cultural, intellectual, and moral, that in turn help to reconstitute and perpetuate unequal exchanges that underlay the initial discursive formation. So it's not only, right, that we've got sort of colonization projects of gypsy lorism, right, that were concomitantly produced as disciplines, but that Romani people themselves have been produced across history. We've been produced as the quintessential internal other. From Smart and Croft in 1875, where they write that, gypsies are the Arabs of pastoral England, the Bedouins of our commons and woodlands, and on to George Borrow, right, sort of, forming himself as the Romani Rai, right, the Gypsy King, and traveling across the British Isles and into Europe, collecting language and kind of writing about language and folk tales. And so this kind of constant, right, the formation of this notion of the other languages, other practices, other cultures, not only sets up a binary of us versus them, but constructs the very difference around who is and who can be a subject of the state, a legible subject of the state. and thus reinforcing the colonial project of modernizing and civilizing as a continuous one, continually justifying the colonial production of material difference. So it's this long history and the production of difference that Rosa Taikon was referencing when she set out the terms for meeting Lau and Matadi. This is political. And it's this refusal to engage, to give up the magic, to give up the secret of one's sauce, to paraphrase Fanon liberally, to share our secrets, as Menchu suggests, that frames refusal. And it's key to engage around rights claims, right? Around, it's actually a matter of life and death, as we saw last week in the murders that happened of massage workers in Atlanta, here in the US. And while we're engaging those rights claims, to sometimes, in the name of decoloniality, keep other things for ourselves. So what does that look like? What does it look like to maintain politics, to decolonize, to practice refusal? Well, it's certainly, you can see that in the works that Daniel and Delane showed you in the earlier part of this program. We see this in Rosa Taikon, right, her sister Katarina, but also the Romani people who fed George Borrow made up stories and fake words. The people who, you know, earlier as a means of survival told stories of their pilgrimage from Egypt as Egyptians in order to save their own lives. Romani people who fight for rights and refuse to give up secrets. And so I wanted to show you a project that Delane and Daniel were part of, that their work was shown, that I had done in 2013 with Autograph, which was the Roma news sheet. And I wanted to show it as, again, showing images of refusal produced by Romani artists in the face of, you know, artistic kind of formations, curatorial formations that would actually reinforce the colonial gaze and these practices of hypervisibility and invisibility. So what does it look like to refuse them? I want to say that it, you know, it takes the form of, you know, framing it as this is political on the one hand, of positing a kind of manifesto and a photography of refusal. So, you know, you have a kind of, we see sort of in the wake of the destruction of Dale Farm in 2012, this image by Farhan Haq, where you have the, you know, Dale Farm, Baghdad, Gaza, Tripoli, Beirut, Belfast, and Kabul, right? So the sites of colonial wars, and really framing Dale Farm within that, and also the emptiness of the landscape. You have Lydia Mirkovich in the Belgrade, in the part of Belgrade that's known as Belleville, where she has, you know, an image of herself hidden behind the image of the Carmen, right? So refusing to kind of show her own face, while at the same time showing the destruction of this Romani neighborhood by the city of Belgrade, by the state of Serbia, and in the name of the development of malls and a kind of university sports site by the Serbian authorities. We see it in Daniel Baker. You saw an image of this earlier, right? Daniel Baker's work, Wish You Were Here, that again is a site of a destroyed encampment from 2006. You see it in Delane Laba, where you also, these are the sites in Wales that were former Romani stopping sites, right? You saw in the film that she showed. Again, all of these, as you see, there aren't images being shown. People aren't showing their faces. They're practicing a kind of decolonial refusal in the production of their images. Again, in Nehad Nino Pusia's images for Barnogrash, right? So where he's showing the container homes that were put in place in that same part of Belgrade, in Belleville, as a way of, you know, supposedly acceptable housing of Roma. And then here's some more images from Lydia Mirkovich's her work with Dialogue with Carmen. So I wanted to show those images as a way of maybe thinking through what, I'm just going to stop sharing if I can figure out how to do that. Let's see if I escape. No, not at all. Okay.
Ethel, just click on the share screen.
Oh, stop share.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. So I wanted to share those images and sort of think through then what kind of practices of refusal might be possible. And I think it really is about a kind of producing art that maintains a sense of politics, but also really forms the notion of kind of secrecy and a pushing back. And I want us to hold place for that, you know, to think like last week in light of that, the screening of Tycon, where Rosa Tycon clearly, you know, at the end talks about this politics of refusal. What we had then in response were some of my colleagues at Rutgers saying, well, but wouldn't it be really interesting to, you know, to know more about Romani culture? Wouldn't it be really interesting to know more about Romani history? How do you feel as a Romani scholar, as, you know, as someone who does this work? How do you feel about your culture? Could you share more with us? And I think that that moment of sharing, if we draw upon that long history of refusal, you know, from the 19th century to the current moment, from the 15th century to the current moment, as a kind of mechanism of survival, we really have to kind of then say, okay, so what else? What secrets can we hold? How do we understand secrecy? How do we understand refusal as a tool of survival? And that's really with my current book project that I'm finishing up now. And Danielle and I had done this work in Berlin nearly 10 years ago with some kind of work on palmographies. And I had done paintings of palms. You can sort of see one in the back that's not mine, but it's sort of one of the inspirations. But I've been doing various palmographies, kind of thinking about the politics of refusal, where you have kind of, on the one hand, I'm not going to show them to you very, very clearly, but fortune-telling maps of the hand. But on the other hand, I've been painting the backs of the hand, right, as a kind of way of thinking about maintaining that inscrutability and maintaining that refusal as a colonizing practice, right? To kind of end with, you know, talk to the hand, not to the face. And so I think for me, that's really the kind of claim staking I'm thinking about. And that's really the kind of way I want to think about decolonizing practices. So thank you. Thanks for having me. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Ethel. Can everybody hear me? Yes, I hope so. Extraordinary, and so many things that we will revisit in a moment. I mean, the relationship between what you describe as these extractive practices, the extractive kind of cultural practices which Roma have always been seen to be subjected to, and the way Roma are kind of used in a certain way, and this way in which you describe talking back through this practice of refusal, I think is really fascinating in terms of art practices and the topics that we're talking about today. And of course, it runs through, as you say, everything that's been said by it's actually embodied in the practice of Daniel and Elaine. So many things, many threads to pick up from there. But we're gonna move on, and then we will have a good Q&A. But thank you very much, Ethel. And we're moving on to Christina Grigori now, who is a writer and a Fulbright research scholar and founder of the Roma Peoples Project at Columbia University, an initiative that spotlights Roma peoples and expands Roma studies by examining topics such as identity and stigma, mobility and displacement. Herself a Roma, she has first-hand experience with internalized stigma. Her writing was published by the New York Times, and she writes periodic op-eds for Newsweek and other media channels. Her work has been featured by Vogue, NPR, CNN, Al Jazeera, America, PRA, and The Voice of America. And thank you very much, Christina. We're very much looking forward to hearing your...
Christiana is my name.
Christiana, thank you very much. We're looking forward to hearing your contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very honored to be part of this amazing panel today and to hear the perspectives of my fellow Roma writers, scholars, and artists. I founded the Roma People's Project at Columbia University 4 years ago. I've been collaborating with media for the past 10 years now. It's hard to believe it's been so long. I want to share some stories from my work with them, from some of my experiences at the Roma People's Project, and a little bit about the perspective and angle. I am looking at the Roma studies as a former invisible Roma who intentionally denied my Roma identity for many years, which is the case of many Roma people. It's a way in which we cope with really decades and centuries of discrimination, hostility, and violence towards us. Many Roma decide not to speak about the Roma identities for fear of being persecuted, excluded, and it's a long journey to reclaim your Roma identity, to see where you fit into the bigger picture, and to even dare to re-examine it and make choices on what does it mean for you to be Roma. Especially because many Roma who are invisible suffer rather from internalized stigma, secrecy, family, stories of shame and inferiority. And oftentimes from what I've experienced and what I see from other Roma invisible who are writing to us frequently at the Roma People's Project, their main plight and challenge has to do with their sense of lack of worth and how do they address the Roma identity and integrate it within their overall identity. So we focus on that, and we try to be as inclusive as we can for a diversity of Roma stories, because as a people we're incredibly diverse, and to focus rather on what can we do to cooperate between diversity of Roma, understand different perspectives and stories, but also to cooperate with non-Roma people, Roma allies, and find a way together to understand our Roma global identity and to reclaim our space in the mainstream world. So one of our mission is to make Roma studies and the Roma people in stories more visible in the mainstream academia, media, and other cultural institutions. So I want to share a couple of stories on some of my interactions with the media, because we talked about images and how important images and art and how we are seen visually. So some of the stories of my interactions with the media and through the lens of images. I will start with that. And I will share two stories. One is of the way Roma were represented in the media intentionally, and the other one by neglect. Many years ago, the beginning of working, exploring my Roma identity and trying to understand it, and at the beginning of my media collaborations, I heard a story from one of the journalists I worked with about her colleague. This happened in Romania, but I'm sure it's not only the case in Romania, of a journalist who was covering a Roma story. And they chose through the archive of the newspaper the ugliest possible image they could find with a Roma to add to the article. And that story stayed with me because of how intentional that act was, but also because if you only do a simple Google search on images of Roma or Gypsies, you see this visual of poverty and dirty and people you don't associate with your colleagues, your classmates, your doctors, your lawyers. You see them basically far away from you. So I think these images are, this genre is affecting the way we are seen. So that was an intentional story of portraying us through a lens that was very negative. The second story I experienced actually myself when we launched the Roma People's Project. We actually paid a lot of attention to the visuals and the logo we created for our initiative. We wanted to include visuals of the Roma identity as we have perceived it so far, something more universal, but also something that is showing our commitment to education, to being part of society. So we created a logo with a wheel and on the globe with a pencil. And if anyone from the participants is interested to see it, I'm happy to follow up and share it. And so we paid a lot of attention to visuals and what kind of visuals we have at the Roma People's Project. And I had a collaboration with a magazine, an academic magazine, that had the best intentions to share about our work. And in the article itself, we talked about like the importance of images and modernizing. Now, when the article was published online, we got, there were actually two articles. One was by me and one was actually by a friend of mine from Germany and who works on Roma issues as well. The image associated with my article was one with a caravan. It was a very exotic image. And the image associated with her article was one with a dancer that had nothing to do with our articles. I remember how shocked I was by the choice of images. And we addressed that with the editors. They ended up changing it. But I realized in that case, it wasn't that they wanted to misrepresent us in a certain way. It was the scarcity of images that people associate. And I speak especially about mainstream because there is, and we saw quite some amazing art that is produced, and I hope it will become more and more visible from Roma artists who are working on producing new images about what it means to be Roma and what represents us. So we work with them, we change the images, but as I said, we realized that there is a scarcity of that. So one of the goals we have at the Roma People's Project is to create images, new images about what it means to be Roma and new stories. So we always pay attention to the images we promote on our social media, in our stories, in our events, to not perpetuate the stereotypical one, even when we want to fight it. Like we want to make sure we don't promote it by fighting it, by making it visible. So we pay a lot of attention to that. So creating new images and stories is part of our mission. Another part we do to tackle these issues and have new empowering images is to spotlight pictures and art produced by Roma and Roma allies that present Roma in dignifying, empowering way. I remember a few years ago when we can still have events in person, we had an exhibit at the New York Times building with the Flanders House. And we spotlight some images of Roma from New York from a few decades ago made by Jan Yours. And it was very successful. The images are absolutely beautiful, with successful and beautiful Roma people doing different things in New York, and some of them are actually quite glamorous as well, which is not usually the lens through which the Roma people are seen. It's a difference between, you know, presenting Roma in a glamorous, empowering way and presenting Roma in an exotic way, which I'm going to address in a little bit. And another thing we do, and I personally am very committed to, is to support initiatives and advice that they might want to spotlight art that feature Roma in an exotic way, but we want to basically make sure that they rename the paintings if they call them gypsy. It's a way to decolonize art from our point of view, and also to give context to the paintings. Of course, there are debates whether to present a painting by an artist that presents Roma in a stereotypical way, let's say in a mainstream museum, to take it down, to present the context. The conversations I'm part of in like mainstream cultural institutions on this issue is, and I'm actually glad to see more and more awareness, is like more and more of a commitment to, it's absolutely at the beginning, but it's they're good signs, and I think it's something we could build on to do more, is to make sure the pictures are renamed, to make sure that Roma voices are included in the conversations on how we are represented and seen, and to give historical context, because I think some of these, you know, let's say well-known paintings that represent Roma in a certain way can actually be used as educational material with the right stories and the right narratives, so we can have control on how we are seen and represented. And why is this very important is because exotic images of the Roma, and museums and literature is full of exotic representations of the Roma, especially Roma women, is because it affects the Roma people and how we see ourselves up to today. And actually, I remember when the Notre Dame Cathedral, it was a horrible tragedy that led to the fire. I remember actually writing an opinion piece about the Esmeralda and the movie, and that it's tragic that the fire happened, but since it happened, it could be a good time to examine and look at the representation of Roma in connection with Notre Dame, and Esmeralda is a very famous one, because the Roma women have been objectified and looked upon in a sexualized way, in a way that gives pleasure and is consumed by non-Roma, and in some cases internalized by Roma women ourselves, because there are not many ways, there are not many narratives and ways in which we can see ourselves, and especially in the mainstream society. So these images affect all Roma people, but I think in particular affect the Roma women, because they were at the kind of the core of the fascination in arts. And I think that another thing we try to do at the Roma People's Project is to contribute to more stories and narratives about what does it mean to be a woman, what does it mean to be a Roma woman. So women have choices, so little girls can see themselves through different lenses. That there are different possibilities for them, and restore dignity an equal way with other women to perceive themselves, and to know that different professions, different way to live life is available to them. And I think this is a crucial and vulnerable issue. I welcome and hope more and more mainstream cultural institutions are actually going to address this, because it's not only a historical fact that it just doesn't affect us right now. It's something that is it's still at the core of how we see Roma women. And I'm happy to see more and more feminist movements of Roma women tackling that, addressing that through art and writing. Even weeks ago, we hosted a discussion with one of the most well-known writers, current writers of Roma, Oksana Marafiotti here in US. So there's some progress in that regard. So we, because of the kind of work I do, which is at the intersection of Roma studies, form of educational entrepreneurship, but also because my work is, the nature of my work makes me interact more and more with non-Roma and more mainstream platforms. It might be helpful, valuable to add some insights from my work and where I feel like overall we are on just Roma issues from the perspective of the work I do. So there is progress. There's a lot more to be done, but there is definitely some progress, and I see that in the interest of professional from non-Roma to be careful and examine and consult with Roma on how they write their stories or present their exhibit or art. The work we did was recently spotlighted by Vogue, and we're also having collaboration with the National Gallery of Art. And why these names are important? They're important because they carry a symbolic value in who matters and who is included and who is spotlight as part of mainstream conversation. And the discussions we had on Roma issues is important to get to larger audiences. So the way we are seen and the interactions we have with non-Roma to change. And it's also about power, because if we are not seen, if we're not included in media, and the way we are represented is not empowering and uplifting and dignifying, it's almost like a permission for the non-Roma to disregard us, scapegoat us, look at us in a certain way. But the more representation it is, the more these cultural institutes that have defined, for better or worse, images and help define, different, how we look at different people, the more they take responsibility and the more they examine how they portrayed Roma. And I actually, I was happy to see that, for example, Vogue, they acknowledge that even their magazines have contributed to the exoticization of the Roma women and the cultural appropriation and the lack of visibility of Roma women, but they constantly had Roma fashion in their magazines. So it's time for that to stop. And unfortunately steps away from the the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I see some of the images with the called gypsies, and they are not. That's, I think it's another project, another initiative that I think is important to happen soon, which is
Christiana,
to see how the
sorry, I think we are. Yes, I think we're running over time.
Can I wrap up? Can I wrap up in a few minutes?
Please, thank you.
Okay.
1 minute. Thank you very much.
1 minute.
1 minute.
So there are progress in that regard. There are progress in Roma allies. Like, I think there are more and more Roma individuals who are care more about the topic, and at the work I do at Columbia University, we're building a growing community in that regard. What I think it still needs to be done more is the rhetorics have improved. I feel like there is a need for more concrete support. There are oftentimes Roma projects and initiatives suffer from different forms of financial exclusion or neglect. And I think that needs to be addressed. And a last thing I want to say is that with the project we work at, and I lead, we believe that the ultimate goal is to get to the point of Roma having a voice and being able to define who they are. We also think that happiness and success is a form of resilience and a form of moving forward. And I'm happy to talk more about that during the Q&A or
okay. I'm going to stop you now because we won't have time for the Q&A unless we stop now. Thank you very much, Christiana. Now let's
my pleasure.
We have a few minutes before we open this to the floor, where we'd like to get all the speakers back. So Daniel and Delane and Ethel, please come back. Thank you. There's Daniel, there's Delane. And just maybe have a little bit of conversation between us, really, about the different kind of perspectives and approaches, because there seem to be some quite different threads going on. One which is kind of quite the kind of bold visibility, which I see in Delane's work and Daniel's work, and then a kind of different approach coming from Christiana, and also from the arguments that Ethel's making about kind of talking back and kind of but holding something, which I get very much in your work, Delane. You hold, you hold back. There's something very restrained about your practice, whilst it's kind of so visible. And the same with your work, Daniel. So maybe just a kind of conversation amongst us all, just for a few minutes before we let in, we open to the floor.
And if I could add, if anyone who is participating who would, if you want to think of questions, you can already pop them into the Q&A and we'll get to them immediately thereafter. Thanks,
Ileana.
Yeah.
I'd like to, excuse me, I just follow on from Ethel's point about refusal. I think each of the presentations have talked very much about alternative visibilities, whether that be looking at new ways of presenting Roma, new ways of looking at Roma, or new ways of maybe not looking at Roma. So this idea of refusal is very interesting, I think, because another way of looking at that is, I think, in terms of resistance, refusal as being a kind of resistance, which I said in my presentation is very present throughout the Roma aesthetic. And I think that goes back a very long way, as Ethel alluded to, actually. For instance, during my research into gypsy visuality, I was very much aware of a complete absence of the human figure in any kind of decoration, whether that be on caravans, in interiors, on implements. There was always a reference to nature and lifestyle, but the human figure is very rarely, if at all, depicted. And that for me was very much about for one, the idea of not being able to fully locate ourselves in the world and therefore not really being able to see ourselves, but also that idea of refusal of not wanting to commit ourselves to be viewed by other people. And so I think that idea of refusal is very much bound up in our whole history, but developing that idea of refusal is important for us now. And I think is very much a basis on which we move forward.
Delane, do you want to add to that in terms of your work? Because you're
because I was at St Martin's and I did fashion and textiles, so I've always been extremely interested in costuming and clothing. So I mean, my whole thing is as well, it's like anyone that knows me knows you can't really not see me, but I'm completely invisible at the same time. And it's a really strange thing, because I've been thinking about this even more so in the pandemic. So I can be in a queue and look the way I am with a mask on and a hat and everything on. So I probably look, everyone's got masks on, but I've got handmade ones that my friends have made me, and I wear my normal clothing that everyone sort of knows me for, who knows me. And I can still be completely invisible to people. So I think it's a choice about our invisibility. And it's not necessarily us making the choice, it's other people making a choice. They want us when they want us, and when they don't want us, they don't want us. So it's much more, to me, it's about the power structures that exist that dominate that discourse and that whole subject. And so this is why I think in my work I'm visible, but I'm invisible. So I come in and out of shot a lot. And it's about that dynamic, I think, that's going on all the time, and I do get, and it's also this refusal, now I'm getting to the point where I don't want to get into conversations with people about it, because people will ask me and then they'll tell me, so why are they asking me in the first place if they think they know more about me than I know about myself? It's like, I'm doing the thing with Ethel now, I'm not interested. So it's I'm going into complete refusal mode now.
That goes back to what Ethel was saying about these kind of extractive practices, which I think is what Christiana is also talking about a bit, the way that historically Daniel and I've talked before about Bohemian and the way that the Roma is taken out of the notion of Bohemia. It's like present and not present, and that's gone on. But at the same time, I can quite see how that wanting to hold back and not engage and give, as you say, a lovely expression, give away our secrets. But I suppose then the question becomes, how do we, Roma allies is a word that Christiana uses. What are those negotiations? What terms do you want those negotiations to be on? I suppose I would ask you. Maybe Ethel can pick up on that.
Yeah, I think I really was struck. And for those of you who haven't seen the Taikon movie, I really recommend it. It's brilliant. But I think that, that point that Rosa Taikon made about this is political. And and we see this as well, like my colleague Georgia Jovanovic on, I think last Friday, spoke at the European Anti-Racist Summit. And he was so there was one Roma, it was him. He was the only person invited to come. And then he was slotted under this kind of the section called testimony. And he basically said, you've asked me to hear for testimony? Like, there are actually hundreds, thousands of pages of the ways in which we have been expropriated, done violence against, segregated, like all of these things. Go read those. Don't ask me for testimony. Let's talk about racial profiling. Let's talk about racism. Let's talk about anti-Gypsyism. Let's actually talk about the politics of this, and let's change it. But you don't need any more Roma testimonies, because you have so many stories of, what it, and I'm thinking here, and I'm sorry, I'll stop, but Audre Lorde's point and James Baldwin's point, at the moment that you continually rehearse racialized victimhood, you're already denying liberation. And so that refusal, right, has really to do with a claiming of liberation and a claiming of a kind of profound decoloniality that maintains our intimacies as ours, but that calls upon allies to be political with us.
I respect that. Yeah. Christiana, would you like to come in briefly?
I think that it's for me, what is fascinating to hear all of this is how varied our experiences are or can be seen based on where we like the way we experience our Roma identity, like the angle from which I experience it and what I see in my work. Is there exclusion? Absolutely. Is there are we a footnote to different conversations? 100%. But I also see the struggle and the challenge of mainstream institutions to get to know us and interact with us. Struggle is probably not the right word, but there is an increased interest and responsibility. Again, it's very, very at the beginning. It's probably 0.5% of what it needs to be. So what we try to do at the Roma People's Project is to build on that and to look at Roma and non-Roma cooperations and what can be possible if we make that more and more possible. Our approach is actually the opposite of refusal in the work we do, which is just openness to share and discuss. We organize oftentimes events that have profound and deep conversations between Roma and non-Roma. We're actually going to make one public in the next few days. It's recorded. And I actually also at the same time resonate with what Delaine said about the exhaustion, like keep explaining and keep sharing about who you are. And I think there is a responsibility from non-Roma to look at the information that is already there before they ask us to keep defining ourselves and to keep sharing who we are.
Absolutely.
So
Christiana, I'm going to stop you there because I think we've got a question in the chat box. So I mean, I suppose
I could read the question. Yeah, so we have a question from Michael Asbury. He says, could Ethel speak a little more about the distinction between the politics of refusal and the assertion of difference? It seems that this distinction is the approach towards difference from post-colonial perspectives, for example, is key here, or am I misunderstanding?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear, thanks, Ileana. And I'd love to hear what other people have to say about this, but I think that's absolutely true, Michael. And part of it is that I think that kind of maintaining of I think both the tension between post-colonial and decolonial formations on the one hand, and really thinking through kind of how it is that, you know, and I'm thinking here about kind of, you know, between kind of Gayatri Spivak and the idea of, you know, the impossibility of the subaltern subject position. I'm thinking about kind of the ways in which the production of difference is really key to understanding the post-colonial, right? Analyzing the production of difference of coloniality, but also kind of claiming difference from a post-colonial politics. And I guess, you know, thinking about kind of that, and then around kind of the Fanon de Glisson, Audre Lorde, that kind of decolonial move, for me, I'm kind of reading it as moving towards something else, like, you know, these frameworks that we use post-coloniality, we understand kind of the ways in which the framework of post-coloniality certainly informs how we understand our own subject positions, our own formations, but to kind of take another move toward a decoloniality that refuses settler colonialism, that refuses, you know, slavery, that refuses kind of the appropriation of image. I think that's what I'm trying to get at is how we understand these as politics, but never throwing out the post-colonial, still claiming kind of both things at once.
Put your mic on.
Yeah, he's adding, I was thinking of Stuart Hall and Sarat Maharaj's discussion of on difference as the untranslatable, he's adding. Yeah, thanks so much, Ethel. I was also thinking, just hearing you all kind of speak now towards the end, I was thinking about how there's this extremely frustrating kind of eternal fascination with all things Roma, sometimes taken into the negative and sometimes taken into the extreme negative, and sometimes in this kind of decontextualized, ahistorical, atemporal way, presented as a positive, when in fact it's just disguising really negative stereotyping as well, and how this eternal fascination nonetheless completely prevents Roma people from asserting their rights, from asserting their needs, from asserting their desires. And I find that, you know, also I was thinking a lot about what Christiana was describing as this dire kind of lack of imagination in the media landscape, where there's just like, it completely precludes for that kind of desire and need and presence to really kind of assert itself and come in through forcefully. So anyhow, so it just kind of that timeout, that continuous timeout, that halting of I'm thinking about that actually quite intensely.
Can I just add to that, Ileana? Because I think the work that Delane does and Daniel does, it kind of is a kind of antidote to that. It kind of talks back to that in its
absolutely
and presence, with no apology. And I think that's for me one of the strongest assertions. And we've certainly, when we work together, that's one of the extraordinary lessons that, you know, I've learned from working in this environment. Is this, and I think Ethel sums it up. This refusal becomes a kind of really good way of you know, I don't have to explain myself to anybody as a non-Roma, you know, British. I don't, you know, I don't have to. It's not expected, but somehow it is expected of Delane or Daniel or Ethel to sort of, you know, and that's historic, that's political, and an historical kind of position that people are placed in, and it's political. Sorry, Ethel, what do you think? Anybody else? Sorry, Ileana, yes.
Daniel,
do you have something to say?
No, I was just writing some things down.
I was thinking a lot when what Jane was just saying. I think also your work and Delane's work, but also the way that you think the whole kind of notion of what constitutes art within art history, and kind of the historiography of art, and how it is a terrain of exclusion. And there's several texts that you write about Roma art historically being kind of claiming legitimacy within a field of a domestic, that it's kind of excluded. And when you were giving the example of Laszlo Varga, that beautiful drawing that inspired you, and I was thinking, gosh, like, of course they put it in the ethnography museum and in the basement, right? And there's this kind of even I think that maybe, hopefully, kind of the push for decolonial narratives within the very kind of telling of art history, the very making of art history, maybe can kind of really help, like, crack through some of these like blockages in the very way in which we tell art history, right?
Absolutely. I think that looking at objects as a proxy for peoples is a very potent way of enacting thought, but also of maybe moving forward for groups like Roma, because the as I said before, the object is a very powerful communication tool. It's where the artist and the subject and the viewer meet, and there lots of things can happen, and it removes it from the physicality of the Roma body, which becomes a very messy thing, not just for Roma but for everyone. I mean, when you're talking about people's bodies and objectifying people's bodies, it's a very difficult thing to get beyond. So I, for instance, never depict the human body in my work because of what I said earlier about its absence from historically from Roma visuality. But I think using the cultural capital, let's say, in terms of these objects, is a way that we can move forward in a way that in a kind of way depersonalizes and takes it away from this idea of the exoticization of the Rome corporeality.
Fantastic, thank you. Gosh,
Have you got any more questions there?
Yeah,
No,
I don't see any more questions. We've practically run out of time, but yeah, if there's anyone who has any questions, like please, we can stay for a few more minutes.
That's Michael, right?
Yeah.
I was just going to say in relation to this notion of a kind of representation and museums and historic, you know, and fine art. I'm reminded of Luby Mohammed and her work at the museum in Liverpool, where she's kind of placed these artifacts, the kind of the figures. I think they're made in a kind of balsa wood or something, figures of black figures in front of the colonial depictions of slavery and other aspects of colonial history. And I mean, I come away actually remembering those figures, not the images behind them. And it's a kind of, there's a sort of real discourse created by these small, fragile, I mean, they are actually representations of people, Daniel. I don't know, have you seen that
Yes,
that exhibition?
Yeah.
Quite extraordinary, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
And that reminded me of the dancing that Voix de Rome did in front of in Paris, in front of Notre Dame, where they do a flash dance. So there's a kind of a bold engagement with those monuments and those establishment figures, which is no apology at all, but is, you know, very present.
So speaking in terms of allies, I think, you know, in the UK here anyway, our state institutions, our museums of modern art, they have nothing by Roma in them. And that's a tragedy and a disgrace. So if we're talking about allies, they need to start, you know, talking to us, because how can we see ourselves reflected in these institutions if they're refusing us access?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question, a comment really from Albina Zakan, who says, thank you for all the presentations. I personally always found it problematic to resist imposed narratives using existing methods and means, because in many ways they themselves feel violent and not authentic to my cultural traditions and identity and how I would see and communicate it. Thank you, interesting insights. So, yeah. Christiana, I
want to make a quick comment, because I love the comment you made about the just the connection between exotic representations of the Roma and invisibility. And I think they're really deeply connected, that the more the Roma are portrayed in negative or exotic, and I choose the word exotic carefully, it's not positive, it's exotic, ways, and with in addition to not a lot of stories of real Roma in the media, the more we perpetuate this phenomenon of Roma being invisible because they don't see themselves in the images that are right now. So I think I'm a practical person, and what comes to mind right now is ways in which to keep museums accountable if there are Roma, if there are that depict Roma, to make sure there are narratives that comes with it to explain, and also to push, from what I hear from the amazing Roma artists we have right now, to push for their art to become mainstream, because that's not enough. Having a text renaming a painting of a Roma woman dancing and presenting the content is progress, but it's not enough. We need new ways in which we see ourselves and artists, Roma artists, and present and create Roma images, so we make, you know, more progress in this regard. So,
gosh, so much to think about, and I'm so thrilled and happy and grateful for you all to have contributed today, to be with us here today, and this was incredibly enriching. We could go on for a long time, but we will get kicked out from the network. So I hope this is just the beginning of a conversation. I hope we will, in some form or another, be able to continue this conversation. And I want to thank you again all of you for the great talks and for your thoughts and for the amazing work that you do. And thank you very much, Jane, for helping with running the conversation. And thank you to everyone who attended. We will be we have recorded the talk, and we will be sharing this with you all. And I'm just seeing one last comment from Lena Robertson. Refusal as a resistance strategy is very interesting, a term for mass Roma solidarity, since safety and solidarity cannot be found in society in general, perhaps. Have any of you written about this? Okay, so that will be a kind of an ending note. Has anyone written specifically about refusal as a resistance strategy? Ethel is right. If I understand correctly, you're right. You're finishing a book right now. Yeah. Okay. Great. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you again. Thank you, everyone. And we'll continue. And hopefully we'll see each other in person at some point soon. So thanks again, and goodbye. And yeah, take care, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thanks so much for organizing this.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.